6 months had passed since the failed invasion of Earth. Of the 200 warships that had entered the Sol system with such confidence, only 23 had survived to return home. The Volanti Dominion had sued for peace. It was the first time in their history that they had been forced to negotiate with a species they had intended to conquer. The humans had been surprisingly gracious in victory. They did not demand territory or tribute. They asked only for the Dominion to recognize human space as sovereign and to never threaten human colonies again. The Dominion Council had accepted these terms without argument. Fleet Commander Yoon Taesiok had been stripped of his rank for the failure. He did not contest the decision. He knew he had not failed because of poor tactics or lack of courage. He had failed because he had not understood what he was fighting. Now he sat in his small quarters on a civilian transport, traveling back to the Volanti homeworld in disgrace. But he did not spend his days in self-pity. Instead, he worked on a record for future Volanti commanders, a warning that might save countless lives. He activated his recording device and began to speak. "This is the personal record of former Fleet Commander Yoon Taesiok," he said, "and I am creating this document to describe my experiences in the war against humanity, so that those who come after me may learn from my mistakes." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "The humans are not the strongest species in the galaxy," he continued. "Their bodies are fragile, and their technology is not significantly advanced, and their military forces are disorganized compared to our own. But they are the most terrifying species I have ever encountered. I did not understand this at first, because I measured them by the standards we use to judge other civilizations, and by those standards they seemed weak. I was wrong. Humans are not frightening because of what they can do. They are frightening because of what they are willing to do." Yoon closed his eyes and remembered the battle. He remembered the human destroyer that had rammed a Volanti carrier while its crew sang their death song. Remembered the pilots who had ejected into space and fired useless weapons at enemy ships until they died. He remembered Captain Park Gi-won, who had tried to kill herself and her captors with a grenade despite having only one working limb. "I have commanded fleets," Yoon said. "I have burned worlds, and I have watched entire species kneel before Dominion power. But I have never seen anything as terrifying as a human who has decided that something matters more than their own life. They do not fear death. They do not avoid pain. They run toward both if it means protecting what they love." He opened his eyes and looked at a small object sitting on his desk. It was a human photograph, recovered from a refugee transport during the final days of the war. The image showed a man and a young girl smiling at each other with obvious love. Yoon had learned their story from captured records when Volanti ships had attacked the transport. The man had realized there was only one escape pod left. He had put his daughter inside and sealed the door. Then, he had stood in front of the pod and faced the Volanti boarding party. He had no weapons. He had no armor. He had only his body and his will when the Volanti soldiers fired. He did not run. He stood there and absorbed the energy bolts meant for the pod behind him. Each shot pushed him backward, but he planted his feet and refused to fall. The soldiers kept firing, confused by this strange creature who would not die, and for 3 precious seconds, while the Volanti were focused on the man who would not fall, the escape pod launched. The daughter survived, the father did not, but he had bought her those 3 seconds with his life, and that had been enough. "I watched the recording of that man's death," Yoon said into his recorder, "and I have studied it many times since then, and every time I watch it, I understand the humans a little better. He was not a soldier. He had no training in combat. He was simply a father who loved his daughter, and that love made him more dangerous than any weapon in our arsenal." Yoon picked up the photograph and held it gently. "This is what I saw in the war with humanity," he said. "I saw creatures who would die for each other without hesitation, and I saw enemies who smiled as they killed and smiled as they died. And I saw a species that had turned their own deaths into weapons. But more than anything, I saw love. Love for their families. Love for their children. Love for each other. And I realized that we Volanti have nothing that compares to it. He set the photograph down and spoke his final warning to any Volanti commander who reads this record. In the future, I offer this advice. Do not make war with humanity. Do not threaten their worlds. Do not endanger their children, because if you do, you will discover what I discovered. You will discover that humans are not just willing to die for what they love. They are eager to do so, and they will take you with them when they go. I have seen many things in my career. I have seen courage and cowardice. I have seen triumph and defeat. But in my first and only war with humanity, I saw something I had never seen before. I saw terror. Not the terror of facing a stronger enemy, not the terror of inevitable death, but the terror of looking into the eyes of a creature who has decided that you will not harm what they love, no matter the cost. That is what I saw, and I will never forget it. Yoon ended the recording and transmitted it to the Dominion military archives. Then he sat in silence, holding the photograph of a father and daughter he had never met. He kept it as a reminder of the day he learned what terror truly means, and a reminder that somewhere in the galaxy, there was a little girl who had survived because her father loved her more than he feared death. That girl would grow up one day. She would learn what had happened to her father, and she would remember. The humans always remembered. That was what made them so terrifying and so beautiful. Yoon placed the photograph in a protected case and tucked it into his personal belongings. He would carry it with him for the rest of his life, a small piece of humanity, a warning to himself and a tribute to a species that had taught him the true meaning of courage and love and terror. 5 days into the war, the Volanti fleet had been reduced to 94 ships. They had killed over 40,000 humans in that time. Human reinforcements kept arriving from colonies across the system. And for every ship the Volanti destroyed, 2 more seemed to take its place. Fleet Commander Yoon Tae-seok sat in the medical bay of the Eternal Silence, watching through a transparent barrier as doctors treated a human prisoner. Her name was Captain Park Gi-won, and she had been captured during a failed boarding action against a Volanti supply ship when Volanti soldiers had found her. 3 of her 4 limbs had been destroyed by weapons fire. She had lost enough blood to kill most species twice over, and yet, when they approached her broken body, she had pulled a grenade from her belt and tried to detonate it. Only the quick action of a Volanti Marine had prevented her from killing herself and everyone around her. Now she lay on a medical table, her wounds sealed by Volanti technology, her remaining arm restrained by energy bonds. Her eyes were open, and they tracked Yoon as he entered the room. "Do you know who I am?" Yoon asked. "You are the commander of this fleet," Park replied in accented but clear Volanti. "I studied your language in officer training. Then you know I have the authority to decide your fate." Park laughed, and the sound was so unexpected that Yoon took a step backward. "My fate was decided the moment I joined the Defense Force," she said. "I knew I would probably die fighting something like you, and I made peace with that years ago." Yoon studied the human woman. She was small compared to Volanti soldiers, and her body was soft and fragile, without scales or natural armor. And yet she had fought with such ferocity that she had killed 3 Volanti Marines before being brought down. "I want to understand something," Yoon said, "and I want you to answer honestly. I will not give you tactical information." "I'm not asking for tactical information," Yoon replied. "I am asking a philosophical question." Park's eyebrows rose in an expression Yoon had learned to recognize as curiosity. "Ask your question." "Why do your people fight like this?" Yoon said. "I have studied your history, and I have watched your soldiers die laughing. And I have seen your ships ram ours rather than surrender, and I do not understand. because surely survival is more valuable than death. Park was silent for a long moment when she spoke. Her voice was softer than before. Do you have children? Commander, the question caught Yoon off guard. I do not see how that is relevant. It is the most relevant thing in the universe. Park said, I have a daughter, and her name is Yuna, and she is 7 years old. And when your fleet entered our system and demanded our surrender, I thought about her. She turned her head to look directly at Yoon. I thought about what would happen to her if we surrendered. And I thought about the other species your dominion has conquered. And I thought about how their children grew up as slaves. Yoon wanted to argue that the Dominion did not practice slavery, but he knew it would be a lie-conquered species were given the choice of serving the Dominion or being eliminated. It was not slavery in name, but it was slavery in practice. So you fight because you want to protect your daughter. I fight because I want her to be free. Park corrected. I fight so that she never has to kneel before creatures like you. And I will die gladly if my death buys her even one more day of freedom. But surely negotiation could achieve the same result without. No, Park interrupted, and her voice was suddenly hard as steel. You came to our home and threatened our families. And you expected us to bow down and accept your rule. And that is something we will never do. She smiled, and there was no warmth in it. Do you know why you will lose this war? Commander, Yoon felt his scales tighten. Tell me. Because every species fights to survive, Park said. But humans fight for what comes after them. And we fight for our children and their children and every generation that will follow. And that is something you cannot kill, because even if you destroy every human in the system, the ones on distant colonies will hear about what happened, and they will remember. And they will come for you. Her eyes blazed with an intensity that made Yoon want to look away. You cannot kill an idea. Commander, and the idea that our children deserve to be free is more powerful than any weapon you possess. Yoon stood in silence as the weight of her words settled over him. He had conquered species who fought to protect their territory, had conquered species who fought to preserve their culture. But he had never faced a species who fought with the ferocity of parents protecting their young. Return her to medical care. Yoon ordered the guards, and treat her with respect. Sir, one of the guards protested. She killed 3 of our soldiers. She is a warrior, Yoon replied. And warriors deserve honor, even when they are our enemies. He left the medical bay and returned to the command deck. The fleet had pushed through the human defensive line around their moon and was now approaching Earth. Itself, victory seemed close. The human homeworld lay before them. Blue and green and fragile, Commander, Big Junho said. We are detecting unusual energy signatures from the planet's surface. What kind of energy signatures? Before Big could answer, the sensors began screaming warnings from the depths of Earth's oceans. Massive structures were rising into orbit. They broke through the atmosphere in columns of steam and fire, revealing themselves as weapons platforms of terrifying size. Thousands of them. They had been hidden beneath the water, waiting for this exact moment. The humans have concealed a planetary defense network, Shin Minji reported, her voice hollow with shock. Initial scans indicate over 5,000 orbital weapons platforms, and they are all targeting our fleet. Yoon stared at the display in disbelief. Humans had prepared for this invasion, not for years, not for decades, for generations. They had built weapons and hidden them beneath their oceans, waiting for the day when an enemy would threaten their world. And now those weapons were rising like ancient gods of war, ready to destroy everything in their path. All ships, Yoon said, and his voice cracked. All ships, full retreat. It was the first time in Volanti history that a fleet commander had ordered a retreat from a conquest target as the platforms activated. and began firing beams of energy that vaporized the Lanthi ships in seconds. You knew it would not be the last. The humans had not just defended their world. They had transformed it into a fortress that no fleet could conquer, and somewhere behind him, in the medical bay, Captain Park Gi-won was probably smiling. 72 hours had passed since the first engagement, and Fleet Commander Yoon Tae-seok had not slept. He stood in his private quarters aboard the Eternal Silence, staring at holographic displays that showed captured human data streams. The information scrolling before his eyes told a story that made his scales crawl with dread. "Computer," he said, "display historical records of human warfare from their earliest civilization to present day." The display shifted to show images and recordings that spanned thousands of human years. Yoon watched as primitive humans fought with sharpened stones and wooden spears. He watched as they developed metal weapons and organized armies. He watched as they created machines of war that grew more terrible with each generation. And then he reached the era humans called the 20th century. Pause. Yoon commanded. The display froze on an image of a massive mushroom-shaped cloud rising above a ruined city. "What is this event?" he asked. "The nuclear bombing of the human city called Hiroshima." The computer replied, "This weapon was created by humans to use against other humans. And a second device was deployed against another city called Nagasaki 3 days later." Yoon felt his throat tighten. The humans had developed weapons capable of destroying entire cities, and they had used those weapons against their own species. Continue. Displaying historical records, the images continued, showing conflict after conflict, war after war. The humans fought each other constantly. They fought over territory and resources and ideology and religion. They developed chemical weapons that dissolved flesh and biological agents that spread disease. They built weapons that could end all life on their planet many times over. And through it all, they survived. They did not destroy themselves as logic suggested they should have. Instead, they kept building, kept fighting, kept preparing for the next war. "Computer," Yoon said quietly, "calculate the percentage of human history spent in active warfare. Approximately 93% of recorded human history has included at least one active military conflict somewhere on their homeworld or colonies. 93%. The Lanthi Dominion had been at war for perhaps 10% of their existence. The humans had been fighting for almost their entire history. They were not a species that practiced war. They were a species that had perfected. A chime at his door interrupted Yoon's thoughts. Enter. Baek Junho stepped into the room with a grin expression. "Commander, the human fleet has engaged our forward positions, and High Admiral Kang's flagship is leading our counterattack." Yoon rushed to the command deck and ordered the main display to show the battle in real time. The sight that greeted him would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. The human fleet was smaller than the Velanthi force. Their ships were less armored and carried weapons that should have been inferior, but the humans were not fighting like any enemy Yoon had ever faced. A human destroyer took critical damage from the Lanthi plasma fire. Its engines failed, and its hull began to break apart. Any sane crew would have abandoned ship and surrendered. Instead, the destroyer turned toward the nearest Velanthi carrier and accelerated. "They are ramming us," Baek Junho whispered in disbelief. The destroyer struck the carrier at full speed. Both ships exploded in a ball of fire that consumed everything within 1,000 meters. And as the human crew died, Yoon's sensors detected something impossible. They were broadcasting music the humans were singing as they flew to their deaths. "Commander," Shin Minji said, her voice shaking, "I am detecting similar behavior across the entire engagement zone. And human crews are refusing to retreat even when their ships are destroyed." Yoon watched as human fighters ejected their pilots into the vacuum of space. The pilots should have activated distress beacons and waited for rescue. Instead, they drew personal weapons and fired at passing Volanthi ships. Their weapons could not penetrate Volanthi armor. They knew their attacks were useless, but they fired anyway, screaming defiance into the void until their oxygen ran out and they died. "This is madness," one of Yoon's officers said. "No species behaves this way. But humans did. Humans fought until their last breath and then tried to fight some more. They did not surrender. They did not retreat. They died with weapons in their hands and hatred in their eyes." "Commander," Shin Minji reported, "High Admiral Kang's flagship has been boarded by human marines." Yoon's blood turned to iceboarding. Actions were rare in space warfare. The risks were too high and the chances of success too low, but humans had sent soldiers through the vacuum of space to fight Volanthi crew in close quarters. "Open a channel to the High Admiral." Yoon ordered. The communication link established, but instead of Kang's face, Yoon saw only chaos. The bridge of her flagship was filled with smoke, and the sounds of weapons fire. Bodies lay scattered across the deck, both Volanthi and human, and in the midst of the carnage, Kang Soo-min stood with a blade in her hand, facing a human marine who was covered in wounds that should have killed him. "They do not stop." Kang's voice came through the speakers, broken and filled with something Yoon had never heard from her before. Fear. "Even wounded, even dying, they keep fighting." The human marine lunged forward despite the injuries that left trails of red blood floating in the artificial gravity. Kang raised her blade. The transmission cut to static. "High Admiral," Yoon called out. "High Admiral, respond." There was no response. Minutes passed that felt like hours. Then, finally, a weak signal came through. "Commander Yoon." Kang's voice was barely audible. "The boarders have been repelled, but I am badly injured, and I need you to understand something. I am listening." "High Admiral, I have fought 17 species in my career," Kang said, "and I have seen courage and determination in many of them. But I have never seen anything like humans, because they do not fight to win, and they do not fight to survive." Her voice cracked with pain and exhaustion. "They fight because fighting is what they are, and they would rather die standing than live kneeling, and that makes them more dangerous than any enemy the Dominion has ever faced." The transmission ended. Yoon stood in silence as the battle continued. On the display before him, the Volanthi were winning by every measurable standard. They had destroyed more ships and killed more enemies. But watching the humans die with smiles on their faces, watching them use their own deaths as weapons, watching them refuse to accept defeat, even when defeat was certain, Yoon understood that the Volanthi had already lost something far more important than ships or soldiers. They had lost the belief that they could not be frightened, and as another human crew sang their death song while ramming a Volanthi battleship, Fleet Commander Yoon Tae-seok felt true terror for the first time in his life. The swarm descended upon the Volanthi fleet like a storm of metal and fire. Yoon watched from the command deck as thousands of small craft poured out from behind Jupiter's moons and raced toward his ships at speeds that should have been impossible for vessels of their size. "Tactical analysis," he barked. Beak. Junho worked frantically at his console, his claws clicking against the controls. "The approaching objects are approximately 3 meters in length each," he reported. "They appear to be single-pilot fighter craft, but I am detecting no life signs aboard any of them." "No life signs," Yoon repeated. "Confirmed. Commander, these vessels are unmanned, and they are being controlled remotely or by onboard artificial intelligence." Yoon felt a chill run through his body. The humans had not sent their warriors to face the Dominion fleet. They had sent machines. "All ships," Yoon commanded over the fleet channel, "open fire on the approaching swarm and maintain formation. 200 Volanthi warships. Unleash their weapons simultaneously. Beams of superheated plasma cut through the darkness of space missiles, with explosive yields capable of destroying small moons, launched toward the oncoming swarm. the first wave of human drones died by the hundreds. They exploded in brilliant flashes of light as Volanthi weapons found their marks for a brief moment. Yoon allowed himself to feel relief, then the swarm adapted the drones that survived. The first barrage suddenly changed their flight patterns. They began moving in unpredictable spirals and curves. That made targeting nearly impossible, Yoon realized with growing horror that the machines were learning the first wave had been a test. The humans had sacrificed hundreds of drones just to study how Volanthi weapons worked. "Commander," Big Junho said, his voice strained, "the drones are now evading our targeting systems with 80% effectiveness. And their numbers continue to increase." More drones poured from hiding places throughout the outer system. They emerged from asteroid fields and from behind frozen moons and from positions that Volanthi sensors had not detected within minutes. The swarm had grown from thousands to tens of thousands. "This is not possible," one of Yoon's officers whispered. "No species has ever deployed this many unmanned vessels in a single engagement." But the humans had done exactly that. They had built an army of machines specifically designed to fight wars without risking human lives, and that army was now surrounding the Volanthi fleet. The drones did not attack with weapons at first. Instead, they began attaching themselves to the hulls of Volanthi ships. Yoon watched on his display as dozens of the small craft landed on the outer armor of the cruiser Righteous Fury and began emitting powerful electromagnetic signals. "They are attempting electronic warfare," Shin Min-ji reported. "They are trying to disrupt our navigation and weapon systems. All ships activate countermeasures," and Yoon's order was cut short by a massive explosion on the port side of the formation. The cruiser Righteous Fury had lost control of its navigation systems. It had turned directly into the path of two other Volanthi ships. All three vessels had collided at combat speeds. "We have lost the Righteous Fury, the Blade of Conquest, and the Eternal Wrath," Big Junho reported. Total casualties estimated at 12,000. 12,000 Volanthi soldiers killed without a single human firing a conventional weapon. Yoon gripped the command rail so tightly that his claws left marks in the metal. "Order all ships to increase spacing," he commanded, "and target any drone that approaches within 500 meters. The fleet spread out. But the drones adapted again. They began launching themselves at Volanthi ships in waves, using their own destruction as weapons. A drone moving at high speed carried enough kinetic energy to punch through armor when it impacted. Humans had turned their machines into missiles. "Commander," Shin Min-ji said, "I am intercepting a communication between human command centers. Let me hear it." The translation software struggled with some of the human expressions, but the meaning was clear. Human commanders were discussing the battle with casual confidence. One of them made a comment that Yoon did not fully understand, and then several others began to laugh. They were laughing. Thousands of their machines were being destroyed, and the humans were laughing as if this were a game. "They're not trying to defeat us with this attack," Yoon realized aloud. "They are studying us." Big Junho looked at him with confusion. "Commander, think about it," Yoon explained. "They sent unmanned drones as their first response, and they are using those drones to test our weapons, our tactics, and our response times, and every piece of data they collect makes their next attack more effective." The realization settled over the command deck like a cold shadow. The humans were not fighting this battle to win. They were fighting it to learn, and when they had learned enough, they would send something far worse. "Commander," Shin Min-ji said, "I am intercepting another transmission, and this one appears to be directed at us specifically." "What does it say?" Shin Min-ji's scales had gone pale with fear. "It says, Phase 1 complete. And now we will let them see the real fleet." Yoon turned to the main display and ordered a long-range scan of the inner system for a long moment. There was nothing. Then the sensors detected movement. From behind, the fourth planet ships were emerging. From concealed positions throughout the asteroid belt, and from hidden bases on Mars and from orbital stations around Earth itself. These were not drones, these were warships crewed by humans, and they were moving to intercept the Volanthi fleet. How many ships? Yoon asked. Big Junho did not answer immediately when he finally spoke. His voice was barely a whisper. 473 warships, Commander, and more are launching from planetary surfaces. Yoon closed his eyes. The intelligence reports had claimed that humans possessed fewer than 200 combat-capable vessels. Across all their colonies, the reports had been wrong. The reports had been catastrophically and completely wrong. Order the fleet to fall. Back to the outer system, Yoon commanded. We need time to regroup and reassess the situation. As the Volanthi ships began their retreat, Yoon noticed something on his display that made his blood freeze. The human warships were not pursuing at full speed. They were maintaining distance. Watching, waiting. The humans could have pressed their advantage and attacked the retreating Volanthi fleet instead. They chose to let their enemy run, and Yoon understood with terrible clarity what that meant. The humans were not afraid. They were not desperate. They were confident. They had planned for this moment, perhaps for generations, and everything that had happened so far was exactly what they wanted. As the eternal silence retreated toward the outer system, Yoon opened a channel to High Admiral Kang. High Admiral, he said, I need to report that the situation has changed significantly, and I now understand why the Deshans warned us about humanity. There was a long pause before Kang responded. Tell me everything, Commander. And so Yoon began to describe the horror of fighting an enemy that did not fear death, that learned from every engagement, and that had been preparing for war since before the Volanthi knew they existed. He spoke for a long time, and when he finished, even the legendary High Admiral Kang Soo-min had no words of comfort to offer. Fleet Commander Yoon Tae-seok stood on the observation deck of the flagship, eternal silence, and watched the stars bend around his vessel as it dropped out of faster-than-light travel. The solar system spread before him like a map of conquest waiting to be claimed behind his ship. 200 warships of the Volanthi Dominion emerged from the darkness of space, their hulls gleaming with the black and silver colors of an empire that had never known defeat. Yoon had served the Dominion for 40 cycles and had participated in the conquest of 12 species across 3 galactic arms. This would be his first command of a full invasion fleet, and he intended to make it swift and clean. Commander, his tactical officer Baek Junho said from behind him, all ships have completed transition and are forming standard conquest formation. Yoon turned from the window and walked to the central command platform, where holographic displays showed the position of every ship under his command. The humans called their star soul and their home world Earth according to Dominion intelligence. They were a young species who had only achieved faster-than-light travel within the last 200 of their years. Their technology was primitive compared to Volanthi systems. Their military forces were scattered across dozens of colonial worlds. With no unified command structure, they would be species number 48 on the list of civilizations brought under Dominion control. Display the intelligence summary. Yoon ordered. The holographic screen shifted to show data collected by Dominion scouts over the past decade. Human population across all colonies numbered approximately 30 billion. Their warships were small and lightly armored. Their weapons operated on chemical and nuclear principles that the Volanthi had abandoned thousands of cycles. Everything about them suggested an easy victory. And yet something troubled Yoon. He had reviewed the reports from the 3 scout vessels that had been sent To observe human space 5 cycles ago, none of them had returned. The official explanation was equipment failure or navigation errors, but Yoon had commanded enough missions to know that 3 simultaneous failures was not coincidence. "Sir," Communications Officer Shin Min-ji announced, "we are receiving a transmission from High Admiral Kang Soo-min on the Dominion command frequency." Yoon straightened his posture. Kang Soo-min had been his mentor since he joined the military as a young officer. She had taught him everything he knew about fleet tactics and the art of conquest. Approval meant everything to him. "Put her through," he said. The holographic display shifted to show the aged face of High Admiral Kang. Her scales had faded to pale gray with age, but her eyes remained sharp and calculating. "Commander Yoon," she said, "I wanted to speak with you before you begin the invasion." "I am honored." "High Admiral, I have read the same intelligence reports you have," Kang said, "and I want to warn you that they feel incomplete to me." Yoon frowned. "In what way?" "High Admiral, the humans have had contact with 17 other spacefaring species before us," Kang explained, "and in every case, they have maintained peaceful relations through trade and diplomacy. But none of those species have ever attempted to conquer them. Perhaps none of them had the strength of the Dominion. Perhaps." Kang agreed. "But I spoke with an ambassador from the Deshan Collective last cycle, and when I mentioned our plans to subjugate humanity, she became very quiet, and then she said something I have not been able to forget." "What did she say?" "She said that humans are not like other species, and that we should leave them alone. And when I pressed her for details, she refused to explain further and ended our conversation." Yoon considered this information. The Deshans were a cautious species, but they were not cowards. For them to react with such obvious fear was unusual. "I appreciate the warning, High Admiral," Yoon said, "but the Dominion Council has ordered this invasion, and I intend to carry out my duty. I expected nothing less from you," Kang replied. "Just remember that the greatest commanders are those who remain adaptable when circumstances change. And contact me immediately if anything unexpected occurs." The transmission ended, and Yoon stood in silence for a long moment. He trusted Kang's instincts, but he also trusted his own training and the power of the fleet behind him. 200 warships had never failed to conquer a target. He would not be the commander who broke that record. "Helm," he ordered, "take us into the system at standard approach speed and tactical. Prepare the intimidation broadcast." The fleet moved forward as one, their formation perfect, and their weapons charged. Yoon watched as the human colonies on the outer worlds appeared on his sensors. He saw mining stations on asteroids and research facilities on frozen moons. All of them would soon belong to the Dominion. "We are now within broadcast range of the primary human communication networks," Shin Min-ji reported. "Transmit the standard message." Yoon commanded. The intimidation broadcast was a tool the Dominion had used for thousands of cycles and announced their arrival, demanded immediate surrender, and promised that resistance would be met with overwhelming force. Most species surrendered after receiving it. Those who did not learn quickly that the Dominion did not make empty threats. The message was sent, and Yoon waited for the response. He expected panic or desperate pleas for negotiation, expected offers of tribute or requests for terms. What he received was silence. Minutes passed with no response from any human station or vessel. Yoon felt the first small seed of unease plant itself in his chest. "Are they receiving our transmission?" he asked. "Yes, Commander," Shin Min-ji confirmed. "Our sensors show the broadcast has been received and distributed across all human networks." But there is no reply. "They are probably debating among themselves," Baek Junho suggested. "Their lack of unified command means they have no single leader to speak for them." Yoon nodded. But the explanation did not satisfy him. Even without unified command, someone should have responded by now. Ear usually made species eager to communicate then. Without warning, every display on the command deck flickered for a single heartbeat. All 200 ships in the fleet received the same transmission on every frequency. Simultaneously, it was a human voice speaking in their native language, but the translation software converted it instantly. "You should not have come here." The words hung in the air of the command deck. Yoon felt the scales on the back of his neck rise in an instinctive response to threat around him. His officers had gone silent. "Trace that transmission," Yoon ordered. "I cannot." "Commander," Shin Min-ji replied, her voice unsteady. "It did not come from any single source, and it appears to have originated from everywhere in the system simultaneously." Yoon gripped the railing of the command platform. No species had ever responded to a Dominion intimidation broadcast with a threat of their own. This was not how conquest was supposed to proceed. "Commander," Baek Junho said, his voice suddenly tight. "Long-range sensors are detecting movement from behind the fourth planet's largest moon." "Show me." The holographic display shifted to show the gas giant the humans called Jupiter from behind one of its many moons. Something was emerging. It was not a fleet of warships in any formation, recognized instead. It was a swarm of small objects numbering in the thousands, and they were moving directly toward the Dominion fleet at incredible speed. Yoon stared at the display as the seed of unease in his chest began to grow into something larger. He thought of High Admiral Kang's warning about remaining adaptable. He thought of the Dacian ambassador's fear, and for the first time in his long career of conquest, Fleet Commander Yoon Tae-seok wondered if he had made a terrible mistake.